Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. Democracy Now! Is committed to bringing you the stories and perspectives you won't hear anywhere else. From the peace activists demanding an end to war, to indigenous leaders fighting to stop fossil fuel extraction and save the planet. Our independent reporting is only possible because we're funded by you, not by the weapons manufacturers when we cover war or gun violence, not by the oil, gas, coal, or nuclear companies when we cover the climate crisis. We count on your generous support to keep Democracy Now! Going. Please make your donation of $5, $10, or more at democracynow.org. Every dollar counts. Thank you so much. We're counting on you. Stay safe. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Una América Latina productiva y no extractivista.
We want a productive, non-extractivist Latin America, a Latin America that deepens knowledge to the highest spheres of human knowledge.
Colombia makes history as voters elect the country's first leftist president, the former M19 guerrilla, senator, and mayor of Bogotá, Gustavo Petro. His running mate, Afro-Colombian environmentalist Francia Marquez Mina, will become Colombia's first black vice president. We'll go to Colombia for response.
It was a truly remarkable victory. It's the first time the leftists win the election in Colombia, and he didn't just win. He had like the highest number of votes in an election in the history of the country. And Gustavo Petro really wants to transform Colombia. He wants to get Colombia into a social democracy. He wants free healthcare, and he wants public education for everybody. And to do that, he would like the richest in Colombia to pay more taxes.
We'll also hear from the Colombian president-elect and the vice president-elect in their own words when we interview them on Democracy Now!
We are giving impetus to the idea that in Colombia, a new form of government is possible, governance that is built up from the black, indigenous, and peasant peoples, from the very different sectors of the community, LGBTIQ+, from the youth, from the women, from the small farmers of Colombia, those who have been no one, that is to say, who have never had a voice in the government.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Gustavo Petro has won Colombia's presidential election in an historic vote. Petro is a former M19 guerrilla, former mayor of Bogotá. He will become Colombia's first leftist president after vowing to fight worsening inequality in Colombia with landmark policies, including a tax reform and redistribution of pension savings. In an election runoff, Petro won about 50.5% of the vote, defeating the right-wing businessman Rodolfo Hernandez, who won about 47% of the vote. Petro's running mate, the Afro-Colombian environmentalist Francia Marquez Mina, also made history. She becomes Colombia's first black vice president. On Sunday, Petro addressed supporters.
Nosotros vamos a desarrollar el capitalismo en Colombia.
We will develop capitalism in Colombia.
No porque lo adoremos,
not because we worship it,
sino porque tenemos primero que superar,
but because we first have to overcome pre-modernity in Colombia,
el feudalismo en Colombia,
feudalism in Colombia, and the new slavery,
esclavismos, la nueva esclavitud. Tenemos que superar mentalidades.
We must overcome the past mentalities and behaviors linked to that world of slavery.
We'll have more on the Colombian elections after headlines, and we'll hear interviews with both the vice president and president-elect. In news from France, President Emmanuel Macron's centrist party has lost its absolute majority in France's parliament in a major setback for Macron. His coalition won a total of 245 seats in Sunday's election. A left-wing coalition led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon won 131 seats, while Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party won 89 seats. On Sunday, Mélenchon praised the results of the election.
C'est une situation totalement inattendue.
It's a totally unexpected situation, absolutely unprecedented. It's the total defeat of the president's party, and there is no majority. We've achieved the political objective we gave ourselves in under a month to bring down the man who with such arrogance twisted the arm of the whole country to get elected without us knowing what he was going to do when he was.
Russia appears close to capturing the eastern Ukrainian city of Severodonetsk after weeks of fierce fighting. Russia's escalating its attack on the city's Azot chemical plant, where hundreds of civilians and Ukrainian fighters have sought shelter. Russia has also increased shelling of the nearby city of Lysychansk. If Russia seizes the two cities, thousands of Ukrainian forces could be stranded. Meanwhile, Ukraine has attacked offshore oil and gas drilling platforms off the coast of Crimea and the Black Sea. The Wall Street Journal reports the attacks could cost Russia billions of dollars in damage and lost revenue. Hours after the attack, Russia fired rockets at the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa in the largest attack on the city in weeks. Meanwhile, Russia's acknowledged it plans to put on trial 2 U.S. veterans who were captured fighting in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has said the men were mercenaries and are not subject to the Geneva Conventions. The Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov has auctioned off his Nobel Peace Prize for over $103 million to raise money for Ukrainian child refugees. Muratov, who won the Nobel Prize last year, spoke prior to the auction.
My country invaded the territory of another state, Ukraine. There are now 15.5 million refugees, and how one must deal with this is completely incomprehensible. We thought for a long time about what we could do, what each individual could do, and we thought that everyone should give away that which is dear to them, important to them.
In March, Muratov closed his newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, after receiving a warning from a Russian state censor over its coverage of the invasion of Ukraine. Israel appears to be headed to its 5th election in 3 years after Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announced he will soon resign and dissolve parliament. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid will soon take over to lead a caretaker government until the election is held. A new vote could result in Benjamin Netanyahu returning to power. The New York Times has wrapped up a months-long investigation into the recent fatal shooting of Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh in the occupied West Bank. At the time of her death, Shireen was covering an Israeli military raid in the Jenin refugee camp. The Times found, quote, the bullet that killed Ms. Abu Akleh was fired from the approximate location of the Israeli military convoy, most likely by a soldier from an elite unit, unquote. Last week, Al Jazeera reported the bullet that killed Abu Akleh was a U.S.-made armor-piercing bullet that's used by the Israeli military. Unprecedented rain has killed at least 116 people in India and Bangladesh. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes or trapped by flooding. On Friday, one area of India recorded almost 40 inches of rain in a single day. One of Bangladesh's largest airports is underwater. The flooding comes just a month after catastrophic flooding in northeastern Bangladesh left 4 million people homeless, including 1.6 million children. This comes as India is facing record-breaking heat that has devastated wheat production, as well as the mango harvest and other signs of the global climate emergency. Temperatures in Iran soared to 126 degrees Fahrenheit Monday. Last week, the heat index soared to 165 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of Iran due to high heat and high humidity. In Spain, an early heat wave sparked devastating wildfires that have burned at least 74,000 acres. Meanwhile, temperature records are breaking across the Midwest in the United States. In Minnesota, streets have begun buckling due to the high heat. A spokesperson for the World Meteorological Organization said, quote, what we're witnessing today is unfortunately a foretaste of the future. In news from Ethiopia, witnesses say at least 200 civilians were killed in a massacre Saturday in the western region of Oromia. Some witnesses put the death toll at over 320. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed condemned what he called horrific attacks. One survivor said members of the Oromo Liberation Army carried out the attack targeting ethnic Amharas, who are a minority in the region. However, members of the Ola blamed government forces of carrying out the massacre. In Honduras, David Castillo, a former U.S.-trained Honduran military officer and businessman, has been sentenced to 22 years and 6 months in prison for his role in ordering and planning the 2016 assassination of Berta Cáceres, a Lenca land and water defender. Castillo is the former president of the hydroelectric corporation DESA. Cáceres was assassinated as she led the fight against the construction of DESA's massive hydroelectric dam on a river in southwestern Honduras that's sacred to the Lenca people. Newly released surveillance camera footage from inside the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, has shed new light on the police response to last month's mass shooting at the school that killed 19 fourth graders and 2 of their teachers. New video shows heavily armed officers were inside the school and had at least one ballistic shield just minutes after the gunman entered the school. But officers didn't enter the classroom for another 58 minutes. It has also emerged that a Uvalde police officer had a chance to shoot the gunman before he entered the school, but the officer declined to take the shot, fearing he could accidentally hit someone else. Some 17 million children in the United States are now eligible to receive COVID vaccines beginning today. Over the weekend, the CDC and FDA signed off on 2-dose Moderna and 3-dose Pfizer vaccines for children as young as 6 months old. Until now, only children 5 and older were eligible to be vaccinated. The House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is holding its 4th public hearing today with a focus on Donald Trump's efforts to pressure state officials to overturn the 2020 election. Witnesses testifying include Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Arizona House Speaker Rusty Bowers. Democracy Now! Will stream the hearing live at democracynow.org beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern. A member of the January 6th committee, Illinois Republican Congressmember Adam Kinzinger, has revealed he recently received a death threat targeting him, his wife, and their newborn child. Kinzinger is one of only 2 Republicans on the House Select Committee. Last year, he was one of just 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump after the insurrection. In related news, former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens has released a new campaign ad calling for moderate Republicans known as rhinos to be hunted down and shot. Rhino stands for Republicans in name only. In the video, Eric Greitens, a Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate in Missouri, is seen with a shotgun raiding a house alongside a group of heavily armed men in battle gear.
I'm Eric Greitens, Navy SEAL, and today we're going rhino hunting. The rhino feeds on corruption and is marked by the stripes of cowardice.
Facebook has removed the campaign video, and Twitter blocked it from being shared. In 2018, Eric Greitens resigned as governor of Missouri after a woman he was having an affair with accused him of sexual assault and taking non-consensual nude photographs after he tied her up naked in his basement. Greitens' ex-wife has also accused him of abusing her and their young son. The Texas Republican Party has approved a radical new platform. It rejects the results of the 2020 election, claims Joe Biden's not the legitimately elected president of the United States. The Texas GOP also calls for the abolition of abortion, the prohibition of sex education in schools, and the overturning of the Supreme Court case legalizing same-sex marriage while referring to homosexuality as, quote, an abnormal lifestyle choice, unquote. The Republican platform also criticizes Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas for working on a bipartisan gun legislation. The platform also reiterates that Texas retains the right to secede from the United States. Workers at an Apple store in Towson, Maryland, have voted to become the first unionized Apple store in the country. Despite pressure from Apple, about two-thirds of the store's workers voted to be represented by the Apple Coalition of Organized Retail Employees. On Monday, President Biden said he's proud of the workers who unionized. And thousands gathered in Washington, D.C. Saturday for the mass Poor People's and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March. Speakers included Bishop William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, which organized the Day of Action.
We know that when the nation is moving away from the principles of life, liberty, justice, the pursuit of happiness for all people, and there's been a long train of abuses, and the nation has become more profitable for a few and less perfect for others, we must correct the nation, and we can't be silent anymore.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, we look at the historic election in Colombia. Stay with us.
Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Ven a defender lo nuestro, me dice mi hermosa gente. Ven a defender lo nuestro, me dice mi hermosa gente. Para que Gustavo Petro sea nuestro presidente. Para que Gustavo Petro sea nuestro presidente. Ay, Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Y yo lo digo en mi canto, que si se acaba la guerra. Y yo lo digo en mi canto, que si se acaba la guerra. Yo regreso a nuestro campo para cultivar la tierra. Yo regreso a nuestro campo para cultivar la tierra. Ay, Petro, Petro, voy a votar por Petro. Petro, Petro.
Ay, Petro, by Pedro Castrillon, the song in support of Colombia's president-elect Gustavo Petro. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan González in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, today we spend the show in Colombia. We begin the program right there in Colombia, where an historic vote took place on Sunday. Gustavo Petro was elected Colombia's first leftist president. His running mate, the Afro-Colombian environmentalist Francia Márquez Mina, also made history by being elected Colombia's first black vice president. Thousands of their supporters took to the streets in celebration in the capital, Bogotá, and across Colombia.
For 200 years, we have been governed by the same people, but today begins to transition to a government of change that will benefit all Colombians.
Gustavo Petro is a former M19 guerrilla, a former senator, and the former mayor of Bogotá. He's vowed to fight worsening poverty and inequality in Colombia by raising taxes on the rich, expanding social programs, as well as access to education and health care. He's called on Colombia to halt new oil extraction and to move away from an economy long dependent on fossil fuel. Petro has also said his government plans to restore relations with Venezuela and renegotiate a trade deal with the United States to better benefit Colombians. Petro won over 50% of the vote in a runoff, defeating right-wing real estate millionaire Rodolfo Hernández, who received about 47% of the vote. Petro addressed his supporters Sunday night.
Nosotros vamos a desarrollar el capitalismo en Colombia.
We will develop capitalism in Colombia.
No porque lo adoremos,
not because we worship it,
sino porque tenemos primero que superar,
but because we first have to overcome pre-modernity in Colombia,
el feudalismo en Colombia,
feudalism in Colombia, and the new slavery.
Esclavismos, la nueva esclavitud. Tenemos que superar mentalidades.
We must overcome the past mentalities and behaviors linked to that world of slavery.
At his side was Petro's vice president-elect, Francia Márquez Mina, a prominent land and water defender who was born in a small village in the southwestern Cauca region, where she led resistance against illegal gold mining despite ongoing death threats. She won the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize in 2018, is also a lawyer and a former housekeeper. On Sunday, Francia Márquez Mina took to the stage to thank supporters.
Hermanos y hermanas.
Brothers and sisters, we have made an important step forward. After 214 years, we will have a government that represents the people.
For more, we go to Colombia, where we're joined by two guests. In Bogota, the capital of Colombia, Simone Bruno is an Italian video journalist, has been there for years. And in the Cauca region, we're joined by Manuel Rosenthal, a Colombian physician, longtime grassroots activist who's been exiled several times for his political activities, is part of the organization Pueblos en Camino, or People on the Path. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Manuel. If you can talk about the significance of this election with Petro as president and with Francia Márquez as vice president-elect from the region where you are in Cauca.
Good morning, Amy and everybody. Good morning, Simone. First, I'd like to convey to everybody the feeling of joy, overwhelming emotion and joy that we've all felt and that we felt on Sunday. Our fear was that the election was going to be stolen. There was every indication for that. There was repression by the armed forces. Everything was against Petro, in spite of the fact that we knew if there was no fraud or not enough fraud, he would win. So the feeling is of enormous relief, huge relief, and there's a party in this country. For the first time, an election can be won by the people in spite of the machinery. At the same time, the same magnitude of that joy is the magnitude of our concern so that it doesn't become a disillusion. Those two feelings are joined together, so the party, our party, is once again a celebration of freedom and a concern that we need to organize and mobilize to make change possible.
And I wanted to ask you, Manuel, in terms of the victory of Gustavo Petro is clearly a major advance in Latin America. However, there's still a problem that his ambitious program may be stalled to some degree by the fact that his coalition does not have a majority in the Colombian Congress. What do you foresee now in terms of the battles between the conservative forces in the Congress contending or opposing his program?
Juan, your question is exactly on the spot. Yes. The big concern is, let's put it broadly, even further, even beyond Congress. The establishment in Colombia runs for corruption, for mafias, for transnational corporate interests, and for an army that supports all this and gains a lot of profit and benefit from this. So there's a new government that has to rule on within this structure. The structure has not changed, the powers have not changed, and they have to rule there. So President-elect Petro has promised three things. He has promised social justice, he has promised environmental justice, and he has promised peace. To promise that and to achieve that within an establishment that is as rotten as the Colombian establishment is really to promise what we all want, but it is to promise too much. That cannot be achieved by a government from a government. And you must remember that Gustavo Petro and Francia Márquez reached the presidency after and because of a massive popular uprising against that establishment of which he becomes the government now. So now he doesn't have a majority in government. I'll just give you an idea. He has 20 members of Senate on his side. He needs 54 to pass any initiative. He can achieve 40 or 44 with alliances. So he would have to ally himself with the far right to achieve anything. Add to that all of the control institutions, the Attorney General, every one of those have been left by the mafia run by Uribe, Duque, and all the narco and transnational corporate and army assassins. All of that has been left in place for the next couple of years under enemies of this government and of the Colombian people. So the concern is exactly that. He promised, and so did Francia, what we want. But the fact is he cannot achieve it. He can't achieve it quickly. So he will have to compromise with those that have led us into this disaster. So the hurdle has been overcome by winning the election, but the main hurdle, the establishment, cannot be changed from the government. It has to be changed from the people, by the people, and government is key to it, but it cannot achieve its promises without peoples organized with an agenda. Do we know this? That's my question.
And I also wanted to ask you about the candidate he defeated, Rodolfo Hernandez, who also was supposedly an anti-establishment candidate, but a right-wing populist, campaigning against corruption. But in the week before the election, a video surfaced from a Colombian magazine, and it got a lot of views, hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube, of Rodolfo Hernandez being on a yacht in Miami last October, a yacht, he and his sons, a yacht that was financed by Pfizer, by lobbyists for the Pfizer drug company. I'm wondering, did you think that had any impact on some people who were wavering between Gustavo Petro and Rodolfo Hernandez in the vote?
It may have, but what it really did was expose the fact that Rodolfo Hernandez was really the candidate of transnational and national corporate interests. What was discovered was that the yacht, in the yacht were corporate representatives of Pfizer, the transnational pharmaceutical corporation, and that this happened in October 2019. But when Daniel Coronel, the journalist from that journal, Cambio, investigated and checked with Pfizer to see who had funded this yacht and this holiday without providing dates. Their response, surprisingly, was that a week before, Pfizer representatives and high officials had met with Rodolfo Hernandez. So a lot of information has been gathered up for the fact that Rodolfo Hernandez was, in fact, the candidate of the wealthiest corporate interest in Colombia and the continent, while lying, stating that he was against this. In fact, he had promised, if he was elected, to declare a state of exception or internal commotion, and that state of exception would allow him to run the country, and that he would create a sort of parallel cabinet run exclusively by corporate interests. So what we had here was Petro and Francia Marquez, or a dictatorship of corporate interests in the country. So I think that played. But I'll tell you, Juan, what really played out and what the right didn't calculate. The right obtained 10.5 million votes, which is more or less the same as Duque obtained 4 years ago to beat Petro, who had 8.5 million votes 4 years ago. But Petro this time had 11.5 million votes, and we know where they came from. They came from women and they came from youth in this country. The image that we'll never forget here was indigenous peoples from the jungles of the Pacific coast in Colombia coming on the rivers in canoes, 2 days traveling to place their vote. So what happened here was we said enough, the same enough that we said in the popular uprising in 2021. That spirit is what allowed Petro to win. The right thought was convinced it was going to win. They are shocked to see that 2.5 million people appeared from nowhere, according to their calculations, to say enough. So that's the story.
What was also interesting and may surprise a U.S. audience is that Hernandez conceded defeat immediately, unlike in the United States. But I wanted to go to Bogota, the capital, and go back a few years to 2018, anti-government protesters leading multiple national strikes in Colombia, denouncing the government of the right-wing President Ivan Duque, at one point bringing hundreds of thousands of people into the streets for the largest national strike Colombia had seen in decades. Police responded violently, killing several protesters, including 18-year-old student Dylan Cruz, who was shot in the head by a police projectile. Well, on Sunday, after Gustavo Petro and Marquez declared victory in Colombia's historic presidential election, Dylan Cruz's mother, Jenny Alejandra Medina, joined President-elect Petro and Marquez on the stage calling for justice in her son's killing.
Buenas noches para todos.
Good night to all. On behalf of my son, Dylan, who is one more victim of this country, on behalf of all the victims of the false positives, Nicolas Neira, Yuri Neira, Diego Felipe Becerra, and on behalf of all those victims of this government and previous ones, I raise my voice on behalf of my son to demand justice, and I welcome you, President, because we all have our hopes in you, in justice. You are the hope of us, the poor, the needy. You are the hope of the black, the white, the rich, the poor. You are the hope. Welcome to Colombia, to our country, President.
So that's Dylan Cruz's mother, Jenny Alejandra Medina, in an unprecedented show of support, standing next to the president-elect, as well as the vice president-elect. Simone Bruno, you were in Bogota. Can you talk about the significance of this and the issue of state violence that Francia Marquez, as well as Petro, must take on immediately?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation, and it's an honor to be here with Manuel. I know since almost 20 years. Yeah, that was one of the most important and moving moments on the night of Sunday when Gustavo Petro won the election. It is the first time ever that somebody like the mother of one of the youth killed during a protest in Colombia. And this happened quite a lot because there was a protest happening in 2019, then there was a pandemic closed down, and the protest came back in 2021, where other 40 kids have been killed, at least 40, by police and ESMAD anti-Motins groups. So it was the first time that a mother had the chance to talk to an audience, to talk to a president, to look in the eyes an elected president and ask for justice for his son. So, as you were saying at the beginning, this is a very historical moment as a leftist won the election in Colombia with the highest number of votes in the history of a presidential election. More than 11 million of votes, as Manuel was saying before. But it is not the first time that a leftist would have won the election in Colombia. Everything started in 2048 when the populist candidate Gaitan was killed, and at that time populism was a historical populism. Peron-style populism. So it was killed, and the violence that we are still living here in Colombia today began that day in 1948. But back in 1990, three presidential candidates, leftists, were killed, Galan, Jaramillo, and Pizarro. And so the importance of the election of Petro is not that for the first time, the left would have won the election in Colombia, but that for the first time they didn't kill a leftist candidate, so he won the election. What his program means, if Petro and Francia Marquez will be able to implement it, it will really mean a change, an historical change in the country. Petro is a social Democrat. He wants to transform Colombia in a social democrat way. He wants the healthcare to become public. He wants the public education to improve. And he wants to the richest Colombians, the 4,000 richest Colombians, to pay taxes as the rest of the country does. And he wants the richest companies in the country to also pay taxes, which is not happening at this point. And he will use that money to do two things. As Petro is not is quite conservative in fiscal matters, so what he would like to do is pay part of the social reforms with those money, but also reduce the deficit, the fiscal deficit in the country. That's what the same thing we saw when he was mayor of the city of Bogota. He implemented a lot of social reforms in the city, but at the same time he reduced the debt of the city, and he had an improve in the rating. The Fitch company improved the rating of the city of Bogota during that time.
Simone, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the importance of this election throughout Latin America. We've seen now a second pink tide developing across the region, following the first one that started in the 1990s. We've had Xiomara Castro in Honduras, Pedro Castillo in Peru, Gabriel Boric in Chile, Luis Arce in Bolivia, and now this historic election in Colombia. How do you see this affecting the politics of the region vis-a-vis the United States?
Well, this is an historical moment, even because Lula could come back to the presidency in Brazil, which is key, of course, to change the politics and the policies of the whole region because of the importance of Brazil in South America. But as you said, this is a second wave in 20 years of the leftist government coming in power in Latin America, and possibly they learn from the good things that have been done by Evo Morales, the good things that have been done by Rafael Correa, for example, or the same Lula in Brazil, and probably they also learn from the mistakes, like, of course, that Venezuela had a lot of problems during the past 20 years. So what might happen and what should really happen is that Latin America, or at least South America to begin with, will try to unify the markets in a similar way to what happened in the European Union. This has been tried for decades in Latin America. This scheme of integration have been going on for decades, and they never succeed because in general they have been politicized. Just think to the latest two, the CAN and the Mercosur have always been considered a right-wing market and a left-wing market. Well, what could happen, what should happen if the region really wants to improve the economics is that they should close to the external markets, especially United States, and they should try to develop internal markets inside South America and trying to produce goodies. One of the main arguments of Petro related to Venezuela is that they need to reopen the border, they need to reestablish the connection and the relation. For example, Venezuela was the second market of goods coming from Colombia till the era of Álvaro Uribe, and that was accounting up to $6 billion per year. And that market was shut down because of ideology during President Uribe era. So probably what might happen now is that finally the South American country and maybe the Latin American country, including Mexico ruled by Manuel López Obrador, or Central America that is changing as well, they will decide to unify and close the markets and decide to grow together.
Well, we want to thank you for being with us, Simone Bruno, video journalist in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and Manuel Rosenthal in Cauca, Colombian physician and activist, part of the group People on the Path, Pueblos en Camino. When we come back, we're going to hear from the first leftist president himself, Gustavo Petro, when we interviewed him on Democracy Now! A few years ago, as well as Francia Márquez Mina, Colombia's first black vice president. We hear from both of them in their own words on Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Soy de las mariposas, la gran afortunada, por compartir con todos semejante jornada, visto de mil colores, como lo hacen las flores, y eso hace que me sienta querendona y contenta. Me muero por el verde, me encanta el amarillo y el blanco a cualquier hora, porque es el más sencillo. El rojo por lo alegre, el negro por lo serio y el azul en oleadas, porque así nace el cielo. Y cuando se me antoja que honrar un
La Mariposa by Colombian musicians Victoria Sur and Jorge Velosa. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan González. Following the historic victory in Colombia's presidential election of the former guerrilla M19 member, former senator, former mayor of Bogotá, Gustavo Petro, and his running mate, the Afro-Colombian environmentalist Francia Márquez Mina, we turn to our interviews with them on Democracy Now! Francia Márquez Mina has made history by being elected Colombia's first black vice president. In March of this year, I spoke to Francia Márquez when she was running for president. She lost in the primary to Petro, but he went on to choose her as his running mate. I asked her why she was running for office.
Well,
I think that more than making history, we are giving impetus to the idea that in Colombia, a new form of government is possible, governance that is built up from the black, indigenous, and peasant peoples, from the very different sectors of the community, LGBTIQ+, from the youth, from the women, from the small farmers of Colombia, those who have been no one, that is to say, who have never had a voice in the government, who have never had a voice in order to put forward our grievances as a people. And today we need to put forward the nobodies, the people who've never had a voice, to step into the state so that we can write our own history, a history that would make it possible to live with dignity, with justice, with equity, with equality, that would enable each and every one of us to turn the page of violence of the armed conflict and to pursue agenda of social justice.
If you can talk about what that social justice agenda would look like in Colombia.
Well, I think the first thing is that this government has destroyed the possibility of living in peace. And today, the most impoverished people, those who don't have drinking water, basic sanitation, education, internet connectivity, are the people who once again are suffering the brunt of the violence and the armed conflict. It's the social leaders who continue to be assassinated. The Constitutional Court has just recognize the unconstitutional state of affairs in terms of the failure of this government to implement the peace accords. So this situation of armed conflict and abandonment in terms of no social investment, that needs to be brought to a halt. It's not going to be brought to a halt by the privileged elites of white men who have historically governed our country. It's the people who need to step forward to press express their grievances, and so it's necessary to work in depth to achieve peace. This means a dialogue with all of the armed actors who continue putting our lives at risk, including those who are part of the Colombian state, the military forces who continue to violate human rights. That means taking on the challenge we have as humankind today to bring a halt to the environmental crisis. And for that, we propose a transition from an extractive industries based investment policy to sustainable energy and to having a system of economic production that puts life at the center. That is why I've been proposing a program of agroecological productive projects, and with the idea of food sovereignty being the top issue. There's more than 21 million people in Colombia who don't eat enough, who go to bed hungry every night.
Francia Marquez Mina, when you announced your intention to run for president, you had just spent days consoling the mothers of 5 young black men who'd been targeted by paramilitaries and killed. Who were they? You tweeted at the time, "I want to be president of this country. I want our people to be free and dignified. I want our people to be able to freely exist in their cultural diversity, for our territories to become spaces of life, and for our children to live without fear of being murdered." Talk about what happened.
Yo soy mamá, sí.
I am a mother. I have 2 children. I just bid farewell to my son, who is living in Boston. I had to get him out of Colombia in order to be able to go forward on this political path. And as a mother, I have felt the pain and the sadness of our country having to bury nephews and nieces of mine. I lost an 8-year-old niece who was assassinated in a poor neighborhood of Cali. That is a history that is repeated day after day. Mothers go to work in the homes of their families, and they come home to bury their children. That is the history of our country, and in order to lighten the pain of these mothers who are burying their children in the poor neighborhoods every day, in the small villages, in the communities, is part of the challenge that we're facing. And that means social justice. That means taking on the demilitarization of our society, the demilitarization of the country, because every day there are more people being killed in the streets, but that means we need to think about forms of economy that help improve the living conditions of people. That means lifting up life, and therefore we need to talk about distributing land to women. Colombia, well, in Colombia, the majority of the population is women. We are 52% of the population. Nonetheless, women are also experiencing femicide. Women are being assassinated in Colombia. Mothers who are leaders, well, when their children are subject to assassination and violence, well, it's a way to hush them up so that they no longer demand their rights. Therefore, I think that this is a path of unity, embracing life, lifting up life, because we are tired of putting in more dead. We're tired of having to bury our family members and seeing women, mothers, burying their children. That is not just. We deserve a more dignified nation, a nation in peace, a nation with social justice, and an anti-racist nation. Right now, I'm here in the United States, and I know that the Black people here are assassinated, especially Black youth, in the same way as impoverished Black youth, racialized impoverished Black youth are assassinated in Colombia. Because of the color of our skin, they see us as criminals, but we are human beings. Our dignity must be respected and recognized. We are feminizing politics, deepening democracy in our country, because that's not been there. We're giving more content to democracy. And when I announced that I wanted to be president of Colombia, people said, "Francia, you're crazy, because you think that They can't imagine it. They think that's reserved for white men who are privileged elites. But today, those of us who are nobody, those of us who haven't had a voice, those who've been historically silenced and subjected to violence, are standing up to say that we are going to go forward from resistance to power until dignity becomes something that our country becomes accustomed to.
Francia Marquez Mina will be the first black vice president of Colombia. I interviewed her in March. You can see the full interview at democracynow.org. Gustavo Petro is now set to become Colombia's first leftist president. He's a former M19 guerrilla, former mayor of Bogota. In 2018, I spoke to Petro on Democracy Now! When he ran for president and lost to the right-wing politician Iván Duque, who was handpicked by the former right-wing president Álvaro Uribe and vowed to roll back key parts of Colombia's landmark peace deal with FARC rebels. In the 80s, Petro was jailed and tortured for being a member of the M19 guerrilla movement. He later went on to lead efforts in Colombia's Congress to investigate ties between paramilitary death squads and top politicians. Just before Duque's inauguration, Democracy Now! Spoke to Gustavo Petro, who'd placed second in the 2018 presidential race, receiving 8 million votes, the largest number of votes ever received by a leftist candidate for Colombia's presidency. I asked him about his vision for the country and why he believed he lost at that time.
I no longer divide politics into left and right. I think that was a relatively logical way and a relatively realistic way to describe politics in the 20th century. But today, politics is divided between the politics of life and the politics of death. Climate change worldwide separates us into two major sides. On the one hand, you have Trump, Maduro, Duque, and on the other side, you have those of us who want to respond and adapt as quickly as possible to climate change by bringing about changes in Colombian society, economy, and politics. It's life or death. What we were preaching in Colombia is that we need to build the movement of life from the standpoint of respect for nature, from the standpoint of moving from an extractive-based coal-exporting economy. We are the 5th leading coal exporter in the world. That is to say, we have a lot of responsibility for climate change, and we want to move to a productive economy in agriculture and industry based on knowledge, so as to be able to live together with nature. We want to move to a zero-carbon economy. These are the kinds of proposals that we put forward as the main agenda in our election campaign. That's what we want.
It's very interesting that you put together Trump, Duque, and Maduro of Venezuela. I wanted to go back to this issue of the assassination attempt. On Sunday, Bolivian President Evo Morales tweeted, "Within the last 12 months, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence made 3 trips to Latin America to meet at least 8 presidents from whom he demanded support for a military intervention against our brother president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Those are the empire's coup attempts." Do you feel the U.S. was involved in some way in what looks like an assassination attempt on Maduro's life?
I reject any type of violence for resolving social conflicts in Latin America. I believe that we have experienced 30 years of revolutionary wars in Central America, in Colombia. I myself was a protagonist in that effort as a member of the M19 movement, which laid down its weapons in 1989, and then it became a majority through popular vote and played a very important role in the 1991 Constitution of Colombia, a profoundly democratic constitution. We experienced years of military dictatorships, exile. The word democracy practically vanished from Latin America. It was really just at the beginning of the 21st century that a sort of spring began, with progressive, popular electoral victories.
balbucear caminos diferentes.
And we began to see new paths emerging.
Regresar al pasado.
We cannot go back to the past.
Como existe en Brasil, como creo existe.
The dictatorships that exist, for example, in Brazil, as I believe exists in Venezuela, and a threat thereof in Nicaragua and Honduras, a threat of this in Colombia, nor can we go back to the revolutionary wars trying to resolve conflicts through violence. I think we need to preserve and persevere along the nonviolent paths in order to work out our own conflicts.
Eso no significa que no hayan agredido violentamente a Maduro.
That does not mean that there's not a violent attack against Maduro. That doesn't mean that there are not interests who would like to see Venezuelan society collapse.
La sociedad libia, la sociedad iraquí, la sociedad siria.
By the same interests who brought about the collapse of the society of Libya, Iraq, Syria. Behind that, there's a dark and dirty game all around oil interests and the world oil market. I know that the collapse of Venezuela would immediately mean the collapse of Colombia, because millions of Colombians who in years past went into economic exile in Venezuela would come back. And as Pope Francis says, these kinds of exoduses just create new situations of slavery and violence. I know that there's also a hardline, racist, xenophobic, imperialist sector in U.S. society who, with their allies in Europe, believe they can dominate the world and accommodate the different visions of hundreds of human cultures into their exclusive way of thinking and acting.
Estoy absolutamente convencido que son los pueblos
mismos. I'm totally convinced that it's the peoples themselves who transform societies. The issue that I've raised, climate change,
yo le propuse a los colombianos,
I propose to the Colombians and to Colombia that this should be the fundamental line of our international policy. And from there, based on that, we should determine who are our allies and who are on the other side. Together, in a single political party, speaking in general global terms, someone like Maduro and someone like Trump are together, because the progressive wave in Latin America that began in the early 20th century consolidated its role by greater income distribution, the genuine desire to reduce inequality in the most unequal region of the world, based on the rents that were generated by the rise in international oil prices as well as coal and gas prices. It's an unsustainable way forward, which is being shown in Venezuela. And the governments of Ecuador and Bolivia, and in part Brazil, followed that same path. I think that this has brought about a crisis, violating their own democratic principles. We see this in Venezuela, and we now see it in Nicaragua. A new progressivism is emerging. Graphically speaking, we could say there's a new axis between Mexico, Bogota, and Sao Paulo. Now, an important force has won the presidency of Mexico. We almost did the same thing in Colombia with 8 million votes. And it may happen in Brazil if the current dictatorship there allows it. That new axis should propose for Latin America a new role in the international order. Reject being assigned being mere exporters of raw materials, of fossil fuel raw materials. That alone would bring an end to Colombia. And we need to have a new role. Production based on knowledge. Production without carbon. A decarbonized production. And therefore, a new democracy. This is what we propose to the world. And this new progressive axis would have very powerful allies, humankind itself, and would display its moral and political superiority, its superiority of arguments based on science. That, I believe, is what we are now building in Colombia and in Latin America. That is the way forward that we are going to be trying to insist on in coming months and coming years.
That's Gustavo Petro speaking on Democracy Now! In 2018 after losing to the right-wing presidential candidate Ivan Duque. Gustavo Petro is now set to become Colombia's first leftist president, former M19 guerrilla, former mayor of Bogota. To see the full interview with him, as well as with the vice president-elect, Francia Marquez Mina, the first Afro-Colombian environmentalist vice president, the first black vice president of Colombia, you can go to democracynow.org. And finally, today the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is holding its fourth public hearing today with a focus on Donald Trump's efforts to pressure state officials to overturn the 2020 election. Democracy Now! Will stream the hearing live at democracynow.org beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Tommy Warnoff, Cam Baker, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Tamery Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Mary Conlon, Juan Carlos Davila. Our executive director is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, John Randolph, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan González.